Hi, my name is Florian Meyer, and my master student Andreas Winfeld used the Bing dataset for coronavirus intent to analyze how often do people search for coronavirus misinformation related information. So how did we, or how did he do that? Or what's the problem basically? So health experts and government authorities are trying to combat the coronavirus outbreak. They still do, right? But all their actions are compromised by misinformation, or the infodemic, as it is called, that evolved in parallel to the pandemic. The question, of course, is how often do people actually search for misinformation related topics? Or in other words, how can search logs help us in this case to show how widespread misinformation actually is among the public? As mentioned, we used the Bing dataset for coronavirus intent, which is a Bing search query log dataset that, of course, now contains many more queries. But at the state in August last year, when we did the study, it was around 4 million queries. And you can see that most queries come from the United States. That's why we decided to focus on queries from the US. How did we perform the analysis? Or first of all, we of course needed some training data to train a classifier, decide whether a query is a regular query or a misinformation query. And we did so by collecting themes and associated keywords, for example, from the platform COVID-19misinfo.org. And selected 1,000 queries then based on those themes. And then we added another 1,000 queries and we did some manual coding and said whether basically there is misinformation or not contained, or an intent within those queries. Then we trained a machine learning classifier to distinguish based on the training data between regular and misinformation queries. We had IDF feature vectors. We used both unigrams and bigrams. We compared 4 algorithms, and the final model was actually a logistic model that was best. And it turns out that only 1% of all those queries were classified as misinformation related queries. If we look a bit in detail on what those queries were, so QAnon was the most misinformation related query, because also the movement spread misinformation regarding the pandemic being a population control scheme or 5G causing the infection. The second most one was herd immunity, where it is basically clear that a herd immunity, or the large uncontrolled outbreak in a low risk population, is something that is not really recommended by scientists and doesn't have any scientific evidence to work. And then also we can see down here that our title of the post, that does Vinegar Kill Coronavirus, was also among the top 10 frequent misinformation queries. If we look at the time series analysis of the top 5 misinformation queries, we can see that, for example, hydrochloroquine coronavirus sparked in April after President Trump mentioned it as treatment for COVID-19 in a briefing on March 19. But then you can see there's quite a decline. Also, like for other queries, like Bill Gates' involvement in the coronavirus, there are no instances of that query to be found after June, which is quite surprising. On the other hand, as you can see, QAnon is rising steadily. Finally, what we did is we looked at state level differences, right? So there is similar research that showed that political orientation is strongly associated with the spread of the virus. And it was shown that people in pro-Trump states have tended to practice fewer social distancing behavior and displayed less concern about corona in general. So we were wondering, is this something that we can also see in our data set? Can we actually see an increased volume of misinformation queries in the Republican-leaning states? And that was actually not the case. So there were no real evidence for that. You can also see that this is a regression line plotting misinformation queries and regular queries, where there are no real outliers to see. And on the other hand, also the log odds misinformation value down on the left, it shows a high increase or a high proportion of queries, misinformation queries in Wyoming. But other than that, in the top 10, for example, it's very balanced. And so we can't really find any evidence for that claim. Thank you for your attention.